All right, everybody, welcome to our presentation. We are the PUENTE cohort of the Honors English cohort of 2019-2020, and this is our presentation, Culturally Relevant Literature in the PUENTE Classroom, how Latinx, Chicanx students challenge experiences of marginalization by creating an empowered space in higher education. My name is Marco Antonio Chavez.
My name is Jesus Nazaret Martinez.
My name is Ismael Ramos.
And I'm Natalie Salgado.
So let's begin. And so first, a little bit of background on Puente. Puente is a UC-sponsored academic success and equity program, ACE program, if you've heard it around campus, that instills students with intellectual, social, and cultural capital so that they can matriculate into a four-year university. Puente is a Hispanic serving institution, HSI as well, and out of the 14,773 students enrolled in credit courses, 34% are Hispanic, which includes Latinx and Chicanx students. And there are currently 20 students in the 2019 and 2020 Puente cohort. The graphic below shows the racial populations of California public colleges comparatively to the racial diversity among tenured faculty at California public colleges. And we see here, as seen above, there is a fairly diverse range of students from different ethnic groups for the student side. However, for the tenured faculty, we do see a disparity amongst faculty of color and white faculty. And so moving forward. Next is this graphic right here is the educational pipeline made by the researchers at the UCLA Chicano Studies and Research Center. What we want to highlight here is on the green portion, it shows respectively the statistics for the educational pipeline among higher education for Latinas and Chicanos students respectively. And we just wanted to show the just major I guess, difference between populations of students of color and population of white students. For example, out of 100 students for Chicanx and Latinx students respectively, there is a 0.3 of them would make it towards a doctorate level degree and a 0.2% for Chicanos. And we just want to keep ask you guys just to keep this number in mind because we will be revisiting it and we will be dissecting it further. Okay, so moving on.
Education from a sociological perspective. So I chose to look through this through a sociological perspective because I want to major in sociology. So here are some examples of the obstacles in place that are barriers to the educational advancement of people of color. So first of all, there is hidden curriculum. And what a hidden curriculum means is that in the school system, there are behaviors and expectations that are subtly taught to students. So for example, middle class students in well-funded schools are taught to take advantage of test prep courses and an AP curriculum that will set them on a path to a four-year university, while students of color, on the other hand, are taught to seek careers in fields such as skilled labor. So ultimately, this affects an individual's perception of their abilities and potential. And then the next section is define the meritocracy. So in the US, it is a common conception that talented people will progress based on their talent and dedication alone. However, I did some research and found that if a person of color receives a degree from a prestigious university, it allows them to find job prospects that are equal to those available to a white individual with a degree from a less prestigious university. And so what this indicates is that people of color have to go an extra mile to work through a system that favors the privileged. And then another barrier is de facto segregation. And so we all know that through Brown versus Board of Education, segregation in the schools was formally eliminated. But if we look at the patterns of residential neighborhoods today, you'll find that they're still stratified by socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic background. And so what this means for students attending public schools is that they're required to attend the school within their district. So depending on where they live and their background, the school system will either make or break their success, and they'll make it through the educational pipeline or they'll slip through. And so ultimately, we don't want to look at these barriers, the implications of these barriers, through a deficit lens in which we victimize minorities. It's important to focus on the fact that students of color have equal potential to privileged students, and that we must create a system of equity in which students and educators work together to overcome these types of systems that hold us back. Okay, Nepantla and Identity, The Journey of a Puentista. So the author of the book to your right, Borderlands La Frontera, Gloria Anzaldúa, she's a queer Chicana feminist author who has laid the foundation for a lot of values that we hold dear to us in Puente. So in her book Borderlands, she establishes the elements of the Chicano identity that have formed over the years that defy the perceived narrative of colonization. And through her poems, narratives, and research, she solidifies the power that a Chicano can have over creating their own narrative. And so if you look at this quote from Borderland, she wrote, and now I call it Nepantla, which is a Nahuatl word for the space between two bodies of water, the space between two worlds. It is a limited space, a space where you are not this or that, but where you are changing. You haven't gotten into this new identity yet, and haven't left the old identity behind either. You're in kind of transition. So this concept speaks to us as Puentistas, as it defines the state that we're, this third space that we're in right now, as we examine ourselves and piece together the forms of capital that we have begun to cultivate. In this third space, we learn to value the intersectionality of our identities and overcome obstacles such as imposter syndrome. And through the dialogue that we have been able to share in the Puente classroom, we've been able to empower each other to power through the pipeline and exhibit our own feats of Chicano greatness. And so if you look above here, these are just examples of the different elements of the Chicano perception of our identities. Okay, intersectionality of the minority experience, how Between the Real to Me creates a platform to discuss issues. So we had the experience, well, we had the opportunity to read Between the Real to Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he is an award-winning author and journalist. Through the dialogues that our Puente cohort has taken part in, we learned to value the intersectionality of experiences between Chicanos and other people of color. So in our journey to ultimately achieve equity in education, it's important to exhibit allyship and internalize perspectives within our own scope and beyond. So by reading In Between the Real and Me, we were able to examine the value of the Black body and determine the degree to which minority bodies are regarded with indifference by the general American population and through media coverage. So in the excerpt right here, he recalls the death of a student in his year at Howard University, whose tragic death was the result of racial profiling at the hands of a police officer. And so I'll go ahead and read the quote. I believe and still do that our bodies are ourselves, that my soul is the voltage conducted through neurons and nerves, and that my spirit is in the flesh. Prince Jones was one of one, and they had destroyed his body, scorched his shoulders and arms, ripped open his back, mangled lung, kidney, and liver. So in our English class, we were able to connect Coates' experience with the recent death of Ahmaud Arbery, who died due to similar circumstances. We reflected on the vitality of our own brown bodies and how experiences resonate throughout the shared experience of people of color. And we cannot give into these behaviors that perpetuate the hegemony that holds us back. We have to advocate for the right to live comfortably in our bodies and not live a life of fear.
So psychological perspective through the narratives of young minorities to offend their culture and society. And I just want to reference back to Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he states in Between the World and Me, this quote: "All my life I heard people tell their Black girls to be twice as good, which is to say except half as much. These words would be spoken with a veneer of religious nobility, as though they evidenced some unspoken quality, some undecked courage, when in fact the evidence was a gun to our head and a hand in our pocket." So what Coates contextualizes in this quote is the police brutality that happens within African American communities, and he references the disparities of these marginalized narratives that could happen between a parent of an African American child and their children, and he references as these stories to be twice as good, and which is to say except half as much. And these narratives, as he said, are a mask of the fear and trauma of narratives of police brutality and law enforcement unjustly going and internalizing the African American communities, but also it's also being conscious of these experiences that are not holding a deficit to us, but these minority experiences also include Mexican Americans, and I'll expand that more on my next slide, which is intergenerational trauma in young Chicanx / Latinx and internalized oppression. So African American communities and Mexican American communities share the same passing down of trauma, but in different circumstances. Latinx parents have something to be accustomed called acculturation, where they have to be accustomed through American traditions, and where if they have trouble speaking English, that might create a language barrier. And also if their children also only speak English, that also creates a barrier between family members, and just a lack of connection between family members, and that leads to disparity of mental health. And also this leads to a phenomenon called internalized oppression, and the narratives of Latinx of perceiving these stereotypes to be true. Let's say they, as Natalie suggested, that Latinx would rather work in their experiences because they would perceive as college as an elite institution, and they'd rather go into the workforce first rather than participating in a college institution. While and we see that in the educational pipeline, and we see that as true as kids trickling down the pipeline because they perceive stereotypes to be true. And I believe Puente provides a space where we internalize these oppressions as not true, and Puente provides a space where Mexican Americans, there is good representation in the literature, and we can share our experiences together. And yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'll be following up on the psychological perspective, and in this instance, I will be viewing it through the lens of imposter syndrome in the lives of marginalized students. Imposter syndrome is a psychological pattern influenced by an individual's inability to believe that they are capable of being successful or that their life's accomplishments are a reflection of their skill. This syndrome has also been referred to as imposter phenomenon and is known to be a negative outcome of race-related stress, such as difficulties with acculturation, intergenerational trauma, and racial discrimination. A correlation between a child's linguistic development and perceived fraudulence has been identified in congruence of the critical period theory, a theory emphasizing that the early years of life are critical in an individual's development. A study at the University of Kansas examined the quantity of words exposed to a child from a low socioeconomic background in comparison to a child from an affluent background. This study concluded that by the time a child reached the age of 4 years old, a child from a low socioeconomic background had been exposed to 30 million less words than that of an affluent child. This linguistic predisposition is a result of lacking exposure to higher education, parents lacking educational experience, or because of the interference of development due to other languages being spoken at home. These researchers analyzed this deficit and had discovered that this linguistic predisposition caused difficulties paying attention, failure to meet standards, and symptoms of low self-esteem in the lives of children that they had initially surveyed. That also verifying that linguistic acquisition was much more difficult after the age of 5 years old. Linguistic deficits have created rippling effects for marginalized youth, causing young scholars to believe that they are incompetent and unskillful. Although blind to society's perspective, the imposter syndrome predispositions underrepresented scholars by imposing a toll on self-esteem and internalizing an identity of a disadvantaged student. More times than less, these matters are not addressed within elementary school setting, even though symptoms are prone to increasing and causing a rippling effect of mental health issues in adolescence. Reflecting back on UCLA's visual, the imposter syndrome is a key explanation for the results presented within this educational pipeline, as this has directly affected the number of students entering into higher education. These statistics have illustrated that many of the same individuals who had internalized the identity of a disadvantaged student had shown the same predisposition qualities, resulting in a 40% of underrepresented individuals failing to complete high school and an 80% of Latinos and Latinas to not meet their goal of earning a bachelor's degree as a result of not addressing this inequity. Puente English has allowed for students to combat the imposter syndrome through the use of culturally enriching literature. Such works embedded within the Puente English course is Into the Beautiful North by Mexican-American author Luis Alberto Urrea. This story illustrates the lives of a small group of friends attempting to enter the United States and attempting to recruit and strengthen their hometown in Mexico. This story allows for students to relate to the narrative of the protagonists by including Chicanx-styled literature and storylines. In addition, we as an audience were able to find gratitude in our own lives by acknowledging the difficulties that our elders had sacrificed and using the idea as a means of motivating our purpose as educated Chicanos and Chicanas. This allowed for Puente scholars to validate their identity and has been a contributing factor for creating identities that emphasize the importance of equity within Chicanx development. In addition to Luis Alberto Urrea's novel, we as Puente students have collectively analyzed the graphic novel adaptation of Octavia E. Butler's Kindred by Damian Duffy and John Jennings. This novel illustrates the life of Dana, who is an African-American woman from the year 1976, who finds herself unwillingly time traveling to the year of 1815 on a plantation in Maryland. Through Dana's experience, we're able to see that Dana begins to lose touch with her identity as she is viewed as an enslaved woman when on the plantation. The imposter syndrome becomes an active source of detriment as her identity is challenged by the Atlantic Americans that surround her on the plantation. We are reminded by Dana that through the use of literature, a world of hybrid connections can be present, therefore abolishing the racist values that create a deviance between marginalized members and non-marginalized members. Thank you.
So overcoming the more struggles through Puente literature, since there is a lack of representation of Latinx and Chicanx authors, the connection to these enriching narratives that Latinx and Chicanx students can connect to, it provides a bridge of meaning and a real relatability, and that reading through the literature and connecting with it can cause a boost in mental well-being, because when you're reading through these narratives, you find out that you're not alone experiencing through the struggles you face, and through that opens up a new consciousness. And with that, you can be curious to learn more about Mexican American culture and the literature, and be inspired to just be inspired to really learn more. And as mentioned, being that third space of culture of Mexican American Chicanx, and just being conscious and being culturally adapted and overcoming imposter syndrome, generational trauma. And with that reading of the narratives of Puente literature, you'll learn that the struggles turn into strengths. And reading through Latinx authors, you really grab a sense of inspiration that that these Latinx authors, like, wow, whatever they went through, they could get over, and that brings a sense of empowerment and relatability to the culture. And it's a great thing with this literature.
All right, so moving on forward, we're going to be speaking about, how really did we get here? And so I'm going to be speaking about the historic representation of the Black and brown body, which is not obviously, but is in many ways economic and military exploitation. So I'm going to be starting with this quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates. "In America, it is traditional to destroy the Black body. It is heritage." I think I'm going to start off with a not very controversial statement. The United States history, the track record with race relations isn't exactly the cleanest. I don't believe that's a very controversial statement to say. I'm going to be focusing on the later half of the 20th century, starting with World War II. World War II ironically brought race and racism as an underlying issue within U.S. troops and allied troops globally, despite the fact that the whole point of the war is being the fight against fascism, which fascism, if you guys didn't know, is a system of government which is organized under race. For example, the U.S. military deemed Black Americans as not suitable for combat service, so they were stuck with menial jobs such as cooking, cleaning, and other labor jobs. And even after the war, post-war, blood was segregated by race by those who donated it until about 1950. Moving forward. Sorry. And then with that, I'm going to be bringing on to this quote by Josefina Lopez in Real Women Have Curves. "All those years of being an illegal, I still can't get used to it." And so a little bit of background on Josefina Lopez. She's a Chicana author who wrote the play Real Women Have Curves, which, even though it's not a focus, a background of this is the 1985 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which granted amnesty to a lot of illegal immigrants that were in the United States. However, not all. And it didn't really provide that much of a background to war, it took around 10 years until a law that passed which tightened border security and immigration so that it wasn't really as effective as it should have been. This part, I'm going to be focusing on almost the entire 20th century, starting with the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, we have seen that the US government is willing to violate the freedoms of its own citizens to be able for economic benefits. In the 1930s, I'm going to be plugging in this one quote by David E. Hayes Bautista, writer of La Nueva California, Latinos from Pioneers to Post-Millennials. Going forward, there is a massive forced immigration of Mexican Americans, of legal Mexican Americans to and US citizens to back towards Mexico. And going forward with that, there is very much a pride in the Chicano identity of keeping of such organizations such as the United Farm Workers and Unions. And we have to realize that these identities are because of US federal exploitation. So that's why we need to hold our government accountable and to take pride within ourselves in our identities.
Okay, so to wrap it all up, We're inspired to transcend expectations and craft our own narratives. We will not internalize oppression, but defy it. The voices of authors of color have ignited the spark within us to be proud of our culture and cultivate a positive future. We as Puentistas will power through the pipeline and close the education gap, establishing equity for the next generation. And so these are pictures of our service learning trip to Laurel Elementary School, which is a school in Oceanside known for its low literacy rates. So we had the opportunity to read like STEM books and bilingual books to third graders, and then we hosted them for a day at Miracosta College. So we're hoping that we can teach them that they too have a place in higher education. Thank you.
That was a beautiful presentation, guys, and you guys did a great job for being the first group presentation. You hit on a lot of really important points, and I didn't know that Puente went outside the scope of Miracosta. I had no idea. I would always hear the term Puente, but I never knew that it influenced curriculum. Do I have that right? You guys are in a Puente English class? Is that like written on like catalog?
Yeah.
Oh, I had no idea. So thank you for sharing. And we'll open up your Q&A right now if anyone has any questions for this group.
Hello, I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to comment on this presentation. It was really nice. I enjoyed like learning all of this, and like I can connect it back to my my Mexican American history class, and being able to see all those narratives. And I think that's a really cool being in English and learning about all these perspectives that we were never taught. So thank you for sharing, and like you guys did a really good job.
Thank you.
Your presentation was so wonderful. And I wanted to ask, in the beginning, you were talking about how there's like hidden curriculums in schools. And I was just wondering, could you give like an example of how they implement that? Like you were saying, for example, like they kind of teach minority group members to become laborers and not necessarily like scholars, But yeah, how do they implement that hidden curriculum?
For example, like an example would be like in some like school districts, when they take minority students to field trips, they'll take them to like places like manufacturing factories, or sometimes they'll invite like military recruiters on campus to talk with students of color, and they kind of emphasize more of like entering the labor force and kind of just accepting that as a career path instead of considering the path to either community college or four-year university.
Oh, wow, I see. Thank you.
I have a question. I think it was on the slide just before or after this, you had a chart with a lot of squares that were kind of showing, yeah, could you help me understand how to interpret the numbers in this chart?
Yeah, so on the left side is the entire educational pipeline from the K-12 level through college. So it's broken down by race and ethnicity, and then the slash mark just indicates the female to male ratio.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so in a theoretical group of 100 students, starting off in the education pipeline, this shows the outcome. So here we have 63 females to 60 males out of the initial 100 students receiving a high school diploma, and so on. And then to the right side, it's the same pattern of the breakdown, except it's a more specific breakdown of Latinos. So these are all the different Latino groups, and here are Chicanos and Chicanas on this side.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question about this slide, actually. Why do you think that there seems to be more female Latinas going into, higher education? instead of males, if I'm interpreting it correctly.
Well, if I were to personally think about it, I would think that maybe there kind of is the gender bias of like more skilled work being available to men than women. So perhaps like instead of falling into that group of students that are pushed towards like factory work or skilled labor or the military, maybe there are females who are able to find a place in higher education because they're not expected to maybe do that type of work.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Can I contribute to that response as well?
Yeah.
I'm their advisor.
I would love to hear.
Hi. Wow, these are excellent questions. And there's also a lot of research that is out right now through SDSU's professors, J. Luke Wood and Frank Harris, who look at the specific examples of men of color, specifically Latino and African American males in K through 12 and higher education. And what we know, what the research supports, is that the education system is already very gendered. Historically, traditionally, you have more women as teachers. And even more specifically, you have more white women as teachers. So in terms of your entire K through 12 education, so in terms of representation and role modeling and addressing the issues of the affective as well as the academic and how those align, there is a major impact when we have such a gendered field of education, and even more so a very racialized field. So essentially what we need are to persist, to have more men of color persist through the educational pipeline, is we need to have more men of color occupy educational professorial positions. And so we know that is a great gap in our K through 12, right? So just a little bit more context for that. But
Thank you so much.
All right, that is it for our Q&A session. Thank you for everyone who participated, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. You guys did an excellent job. Next up, we have a person that I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's Hawaiian, I believe, Pamai. Do you go by that? I think I have you here.
Yes, Pamai.
Pamai?
Yes.
Yes, you are next up in our presentation. And your mentor is Jade Heidel. I hope that I said that correctly. And your presentation title is Noah's Us.
Yeah, give me just a few seconds. I thought I was going in session B, so hold on 1 second.
Oh, so.
Yeah, I was told that I was in session B, so.
Well, if John LaRue, if you're ready, we can go and give you a little bit more time.
Yeah, I was prepared to go next, so I can do that if that works best.
Yeah, here, let's do that. We can, Pamai, you can be in the next session if you like.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, okay, John, thank you for going. And your mentor is Lynn Miller, and you are presenting on the evolution of cooperative breeding, parallels to human evolution.
Indeed. Let me just get this screen share up here. Okay, so I want you all to think of your current position or status in life, everything fortunate that has happened to you, and think about everyone who helped you get there. Maybe your mom, maybe a friend, maybe a mentor, maybe even, you could probably even say the mailman or the grocer. Humans rely on cooperation to do pretty much everything that we do, but we're not the only animals that have cooperative systems. There's a few different biological social organizations that cooperate, and we usually refer to that as cooperative breeding. So what I want to show to you today is the specific reasons why cooperative breeding evolves and how there's some parallel there to human evolution and the way we cooperate. So I'll start out by defining what exactly do I mean by cooperative breeding. involved a large proportion of non-breeding mature helper adults in a social organization. So adults that are reproductively mature, but they're not having their own children. They're helping other people rear their children or other animals rear their children. And a more rigorous definition of that is that just a single breeding pair of adults. So just one breeding pair, everyone else in the social organization is helping rear that pair's offspring. And so all those other adults that are helpers, they might be siblings of the adults in the pair, they might be aunts, they might be uncles, and there might be some strangers, some people from unrelated groups in there, some animals from unrelated groups in there that are help rearing those offspring and cooperating in this social unit. And this is a pretty rare social organization, but it's found in a wide array of different organisms, including amoebas, ants, birds, and mammals. And to illustrate this, I want you to think of a pack of wolves. So we're thinking of our pack of wolves. There's a single alpha pair, maybe we'll call it, that's terminology we're used to. And everyone else in that social organization is helping that alpha pair rear their pups, rear their offspring. They're catching food for those pups. They're maybe even sometimes some of those females are going under pseudo pregnancies and they're helping nurse those pups. And all of this allows for actually a greater total reproductive success of a group than if everyone else was doing their own breeding, having their own kids. These cooperative social organizations successfully rear more offspring than closely related non-cooperative groups. So that brings me to my central thesis of why cooperative breeding evolves. Some different interrelated factors here. One, the first is a climatic variability. So year to year, between year and within year fluctuations in both temperature and precipitation. And then also social monogamy, which is, adults pairing up into single breeding units of just one male and one female. And then also a short interbirth interval. So the period between births being shorter, that's a factor leading to the evolution of cooperative breeding. And so all of these factors come together and interrelate and mix together, and the outcome that you get in the end is a cooperative breeding. And then also a second component to that thesis, that these patterns of cooperative breeding in vertebrates in general shows parallels to human evolution. So that general pattern that I just described with those three factors, that's evident in human evolution. Okay, so the first factor, that climatic variability. We used to think that cooperative breeding evolved in response to there being limited habitat. Different new breeding groups can't disperse from the old one because there's not too much good habitat to breed in. Those studies coming from the Florida Everglades, actually, with scrub jays, these birds pictured here, you can see that's a pretty sparse, fragmented habitat. But there's been some more recent phylogenetic constructions in birds, particularly Australasian passerine birds, like these superb fairy wrens right here. And what they've shown is that variability in climate is a better predictor of the evolution of cooperative breeding than the means or extremes of a climate. So just those fluctuations, that variability, that itself is the predicting factor of cooperative breeding, and shows that even more than temperature variations in precipitation. So between year variation in precipitation, within year variation precipitation, that contributes to the evolution of cooperative breeding. So comparing this to our own evolution, we start to see cooperative breeding tendencies in the human lineage, starting with the hominin species Homo erectus. And Homo erectus is the early human species that evolved in East Africa about 2 million years ago. And this was a species that evolved in response to a fluctuating climate. And rather than showing you some really crazy complicated graph of what the climate of East Africa was in 2 million years ago, I want you to look at this picture here of these Homo erectus men hunting. And I want you to imagine this variable East African climate with variable precipitation. Things are unpredictable. It's hard to make a living. And in order to successfully survive as a group, you have to cooperate. You have to help each other drive saber-toothed cats off of the antelope they've killed to be able to feed yourselves. This is an unpredictable environment, and cooperation evolved in turn. And then that second factor we have here is the social monogamy. So this involves adult males and adult females pairing off into single breeding units rather than one male breeding with multiple females. And so that doesn't mean that there's not extra pair mating going on. It just means that the reproductive output of individuals is made up by just two adults pairing up, one male, one female, and they're that reproductive unit. And it often evolves in animal social organizations because there's a need for extra parental care. So you bring in that father for that paternal care of offspring. Somehow, you're using monogamy to give that father greater certainty that that is his offspring, and then he will then in turn help the mother rear those offspring. So if there's, for some reason, it's harder to rear offspring, you bring the male in for that paternal care. And so you can kind of see this as like a cooperative breeding light. You're not bringing in this whole shebang of a whole social organization to rear just one reproductive output, but you're bringing in the father as well to help rear children. And it's been some interesting analyses, same phylogenetic reconstructions, looking in both social carnivores or carnivorans, group of mammals, and then corvids, so birds like jays, crows, ravens, including these beautiful green jays here, which you can actually see in southern Texas. And they found that cooperative breeding is more frequent in monogamous lineages. So in lineages where monogamy is common, cooperative breeding evolves more in turn. And so if you're thinking of a monogamous social organization, it's kind of a nuclear family, there's going to be greater family cohesion, and you might already have some of those older siblings around. So you can see how that really spring loads these monogamous social organizations, these nuclear families, for cooperative breeding. It establishes that family cohesion already, which can then be expanded to larger groups. So you're taking that pro-social behavior of the family and you're just expanding it to a larger group that could include extended family or also, complete strangers that are a part of your cooperative breeding organization. Okay, and so an important thing to consider with social monogamy is that in monogamous social organizations, there's less sexual dimorphism. So sexual dimorphism is physical differences between males and females. In monogamous organizations, there's less competition between the males for females. Therefore, there's less size difference between the males and the females. And this is a pattern, or you could say even difference in coloration. This is a pattern that we see in birds. You can look at those monogamous birds on the right, those albatrosses. The males and the females are looking pretty much the exact same. Whereas in non-monogamous species like peafowl, males and females look drastically different. Males are competing for access to females with their bright colors, their huge tail feathers, and the females are just selecting those males. There's no monogamy, there's no parental involvement in offspring. And this pattern's also seen in primates. So you can take that monogamous species on the right, the gibbons, males and females, exact same size and color. Not all gibbons are that way, but this species is. And then you can see the baboons on the left there. Females way smaller than the male. Males got those secondary sexual characteristics, that big mane. Males and females look a lot different in non-monogamous social organizations. So comparing that to human evolution, that reduced sexual dimorphism under monogamy, with the Homo erectus again, where we start to see the evolution of social monogamy, there's lower sexual dimorphism. So that's evidencing that that presence of monogamy. And I should specify very clearly that neither of those pairs of individuals on the screen belong to Homo erectus. I cannot find a good male to female comparison of Homo erectus, but the individuals on the right represent an earlier phase of human evolution before Homo erectus, a genus that will often is called Australopithecus. So it might be Australopithecus afarensis is the species. And then on the left, that's of course our species, Homo sapiens. So that reduced sexual dimorphism started in Homo erectus. And so we seem to think that's pretty good evidence that they were socially monogamous. And again, this is where we start to see those cooperative breeding species in human evolution. So social monogamy and cooperative breeding are kicking off around the same time in human evolution. Okay, so the third factor to consider, that shorter interbirth interval. This is where things get a little bit complicated and interrelated, but I want to point out that in both just purely monogamous and in specifically cooperative breeding lineages, they both evolve because of costly young. So young that require more time, more calories to raise to reproductive maturity. And that's seen in both cooperative breeding and monogamy being more common in bird and mammal lineages with altricial versus precocial young. So I'll clarify what that means there. You could think precocial, meaning precocious, young that pretty much come out the gate ready to go, something like a sage grouse chick or a chicken chick or a peafowl chick, a pea chick, I don't know. These are usually belong to a group of birds called the galliforms. You can see on the right there. You might think that's a chicken chick. I think it's actually a sage grouse chick, where altricial young would be something like the offspring of the passerine birds that's what you can see on the left there, maybe that's a robin chick or something like that, requires a lot more time and calories to rear to be self-sufficient. And that those altricial young are more common in both, lineages with monogamy and cooperative breeding are more common with those altricial young, those young that are difficult to care for. And you can also see this in mammals, not just birds. We're thinking about wolves again, which are socially monogamous and are involved in cooperative breeding. They have pretty, what you'd say, altricial young, young that's difficult to care for. Whereas that non-monogamous social organization, a species like an elk, those kids are coming out just ready to go, completely self-sufficient from the beginning, pretty much. And so something specifically with cooperative breeding, though, is that there's a shorter interbirth interval. This is something that is not seen in non-cooperative monogamous species. And a lot of times that's been seen as just, that's a consequence of the cooperative breeding, right? Because you have more people to help you can crank out kids faster. But it can be the other way around. It can be where the interbirth interval is the causal element, and so it can evolve because of outside pressures driving the evolution of cooperative breeding. So for example, we can think of maybe predation, the pressure from predators causes you to have more babies because you have this high infant mortality rate because of predators. So you're trying to drive up your birth rate in order to really stabilize the effects of that high predation rate, that high infant mortality rate. And so that leads to the evolution of a shorter interbirth interval. And to illustrate this model, I'm going to introduce you to some really fun monkeys called the marmosets and tamarins. They're monkeys that live in the rainforests of South America. And the thing about marmosets and tamarins is that they're really, really small. And so they suffer extremely high rate of predation. Those babies are so small that basically anything can eat them. Every snake and bird and weasel in the jungle can eat those babies. So that causes them to have more babies to counteract that rate of predation, leading to a shorter interbirth interval. And so would you think with this shorter interbirth interval, cranking out those babies all the time that need to be cared for, that they might be monogamous? You would be right. They are monogamous. And then also would you think maybe they would have to resort to cooperative breeding in order to properly care for all those babies? And yes, again, marmosets and tamarins are driven to have a shorter interbirth interval and evolved cooperative breeding as a result. So comparing that model to humans, it's not predation that's the pressure here, but it's our long childhoods. It's our long childhoods that are causing the evolution of a shorter interbirth interval. And what that means is that we have these dependent older children because of that long childhood. These kids that don't become self-sufficient earlier. And you might think that leads us to have a longer interbirth interval, but it's actually the other way around. You take a chimpanzee mother or an orangutan mother, she's going to wean her kid for years, she's going to nurse her kid for like 4 or 5 years, sometimes even 8 years in orangutans. They have these really long periods of infant dependence because after the period of dependence is over, the kid's off on its own, it's living its own life. But we don't do things that way in humans. We have this really long childhood and we have to address it somehow. So what we do is we wean our infants young, much younger than other great apes, but what we end up doing is we take care of multiple dependents at a time. So a mother might have 5 kids that are dependent on her at a time, even though she's only currently nursing one of them. And this, proliferation of dependence that we have in humans necessitates the cooperative care of offspring. So we're bringing in other individuals, including fathers, including grandmothers, including, aunts and uncles and neighbors to help take care of our kids, including, even some of our older children, as you can see in this photo here, using those older daughters to take care of children as well. And kind of wrapping this up with some significance, so it's not just a purely academic matter. That in humans, it's both our big brains and cooperative breeding that has driven such massive success in our species. I've been using Homo erectus a lot as an example here, and I want to point out that Homo erectus was the first hominin species to leave Africa. So where we start to see this evolution of social monogamy and cooperative breeding, this is when our species became so successful that they effectively left Africa and inhabited areas of Asia and Europe. And then also what you have in cooperative breeding is you have the capacity for a division of labor in which you get therefore is social roles and jobs. And you think about how dependent our society is on science and technology. Scientists and engineers could not possibly do what they do if they were still responsible for providing all the food they needed for themselves and their offspring. We rely on our cooperation to establish that people have divided roles, divided jobs, and that way we can all accomplish more as a result. And what you get in the end of this is a society where we all build on what the last person did. So we can build this great big complicated world where, you know, I can listen to what a guy named Newton, or sorry, I can look at what a guy named Newton did with physics. I can listen to Bach's music. I can read Walt Whitman. All these things are composed in our culture and exist there because of our cooperation. We wouldn't be able to have this global machine without the evolution of cooperation and cooperative breeding lineages. And humans in the world would not be what it is today, would not be what they are today without this evolution of biological cooperation. And thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Any questions?
I'm sorry, my mic didn't come on there. Great job, John. Always very well spoken and very knowledgeable about anthropology. I mean, in and of itself, it's a very interesting subject, but you're very good at taking it from like a base level of explaining all of the terms that we don't know, like cooperative breeding, and then building it up into our modern day. So I think you did a wonderful job. Very good.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions, anyone, for John?
I have a question for you, John.
Yeah.
So would you say, so when you were talking about orangutans and how they have a later weaning period, would you say that humans have kind of a shorter infancy but a longer juvenile stage, whereas other apes might have a longer infancy but no or shorter juvenile stage?
On a technical level, I think that's true. Yeah. If you're considering like the entire period that, you know, a chimp, a young chimp or a young orangutan is, you know, still being nursed, if you're considering that an infant stage, then yeah. If you have an orangutan who's being nursed for 7 years, I don't think you consider a 7-year-old human an infant. So if we're considering that orangutan an infant, or if we're considering a 5-year-old chimp that's being nursed an infant, I think we probably wouldn't call a 5-year-old human an infant.
But then you also said that as soon as they're weaned, they're kind of off on their own, right? At that point,
Yeah.
Are they mature, or are they just kind of a roaming teenager?
Kind of the latter. Yeah, they're in the juvenile phase, and that's actually where they're incredibly vulnerable, because they haven't necessarily learned everything that makes you successful as an adult, but they're no longer able to get that support from their mom, because their mom's on to the next kid. And you know, they still get to be part of the social group, they still get to hang out around mom, but she's not going to be feeding them anymore, and they're having to feed themselves and build their own nest and that sort of thing. And that's a kind of this is an improper use of the term, but it's kind of a high learning curve.
Can I ask a question? Anybody else? I don't want to jump in, and if there's other people who have questions. Hey, John, could you take this out of screen share so you can see all your audience?
Of course.
Thank you. I do have a question, but I want to make sure everybody else gets a chance to ask theirs. I can pick on him anytime.
Yeah, I just had a quick question.
Yeah,
Hey, John, good job. I was just wondering how this ties in with other types of cooperative breeding approaches that don't have all the same parameters. So I was thinking of maybe like elephants. I was just wondering if you could kind of compare maybe like how elephants' way of doing things would fall into this.
Oh, elephants in particular. I actually don't know a lot about elephants. Is it just one pair that's breeding?
It's usually just a matriarch.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that what you would be seeing there, I don't know if the factors of climatic variability would be in play there, but you have that single breeder, that matriarch. I don't know if she's mating with just one male or multiple males, but single matriarch breeding, other females being used as helpers. And what you'll see a lot of times in these cooperative breeding groups is that the reason that they're able to have just one female breeding is that there's a social suppression a lot of times of what's called the social suppression of the non-breeding females. And so the other females gang up on females who are about to breed and making sure that it's just the one matriarch who's breeding. I think that would probably be applicable to elephants as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I think a lot of what I focused on here was vertebrates. A lot of areas where it gets, you could say maybe a little bit different, is looking at the social insects. There's some different factors that lead to that, and there's this whole field of just different theories and that use like game theory and mathematical models to assess how these sorts of things evolve.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, we do.
John, one of the things you mentioned repeatedly was the importance of grandparents, and particularly you said grandmothers. Is that grandmothering phenomenon common in non-human mammals? What's the difference?
I would think the main difference, therefore, would be the very peculiar human phenomenon of menopause. Other mammals aren't doing that. They don't have a feature programmed into their biology to have post-reproductive years. So it seems something that's very uniquely human, that human females have this physiologically programmed post-reproductive period where they're more devoted to the rearing of their daughter's children, or their sister's children, their younger sister's children. I think that'd probably be the primary difference between humans and other mammals.
So just to clarify, what's going to be the difference in the life of an old human versus an old chimp female?
Old chimp female is going to keep cranking out her own kids, whereas a human female, she's going to have that period to say that, you know, she's done having her own kids and she's going to help other people have their kids.
Nice.
Okay. Thank you, guys. That does it for our Q&A session today. And that does it for our first A session for this today. And for our next group, it's going to be Margot, John, LaRue again, and Sherry and Pamai. And that'll happen at 1:45. So we're going to take our break and come back here. Please don't leave the session, just mute and turn off your video if possible, and just meet us back here when you can at 1:45, please. So thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Good job, Jackie.